The blood feud that had killed so many and driven him from his home had only ended with his promise, to his mother, never to return. After a while my thoughts drifted, and I found myself reliving, moment for moment, the long night before my escape from prison. That, too, was a night without sleep. That, too, was a night of wheeling fears and exhilaration and dread. And just as I had on that night years before, I rose from bed before the first stir and shuffle of the morning, and prepared myself in the dark. Soon after dawn, we took the train to Chaman Pass. There were 12 from our group on the train, but none of us spoke through the several hours of the journey. Nazir sat with me, and we were alone for much of the trip, but still he held his stony silence. With my pale eyes concealed behind dark sunglasses, I stared through the window and tried to lose myself in the spectacular view. The train ride from Quetta to Chaman was one of the glories of the illustrious subcontinental railway system. The tracks wound through deep gorges and crossed riverscapes of astounding beauty. I found myself repeating, as if they were lines of poetry, the very names of the towns through which it passed. From Kuchla to Boston, and the small river crossing at Yaru Karas, the train climbed to Shadazai. At Gulistan there was another climb, with a sweeping curve that followed the ancient dry lake at Kila Abdullah. And the jewel in the twin steel bands of that crown, of course, was the Kojak Tunnel. Built by the British over several years at the end of the 19th century, it smashed its way through 4 kilometers of solid rock, and was the longest in the subcontinent. At Konkili the train negotiated a series of sharp curves, and at the last remote regional stop before Chaman we climbed down with a few dusty locals and were met by a covered truck. When the area was deserted we climbed onto the extravagantly decorated truck, and followed the main road toward Chaman. Before we reached the town, however, we took a side road that seemed to end in a deserted track, with a stand of trees and several scrubby pastures, about 30 kilometers north of the main highway and the Chaman Pass. We climbed down from the truck, and as it drove away we mustered in the shade of the trees with the main group of men, who'd been waiting there for us. It was the first time that we'd assembled in our full number. There were 30 of us, all men, and for a moment I was reminded of the men who gathered in similar groups in prison yards. The fighters seemed tough and determined and, although many of them were lean to the point of being thin, they looked healthy and fit. I removed my sunglasses. As I scanned the faces, my eyes met those of a man who stared back at me from the heart of darkness. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, and perhaps the oldest man in the group after Qadrbai. His short hair was gray beneath a brown, round-edged Afghan cap, identical to the one I wore myself. His short, straight nose divided a long, pointed face that was so deeply lined beneath the sunken cheeks that it appeared to have been slashed with a machete. Heavy bags hung below his eyes. Theatrically peaked eyebrows like the wings of a black bat spiked above his eyes, but it was the eyes themselves that caught and held me. As I locked eyes with him, returning his psychotic stare, the man began to stumble toward me. After the first few shambling steps, his body twitched into a more efficient mode, and he began to lope, covering the 30 meters that separated us in long, crouching, feline strides. Forgetting that the gun was strapped to my side, my hand instinctively moved to the hilt of my knife and I took half a pace backward with my right foot. I knew the eyes. I knew the look. The man wanted to fight me, perhaps even to kill me. Just as he reached me, shouting something in a dialect that I couldn't recognize, Nazir stepped from nowhere to stand in front of me and bar his way. He shouted something back at the man, but the other ignored him, staring past his head at me and shouting his question, again and again. Nazir repeated his reply, shouting to match the other. The crazed fighter tried to shove Nazir out of the way with both hands, but he might as well have tried to push aside a tree. The burly Afghan stood his ground, forcing the madman to shift his gaze from me for the first time. A crowd had formed around us. Nazir held the man's lunatic stare and spoke in softer, pleading tones. I waited, tensed and ready to fight. We haven't even crossed the border yet, I thought, and I'm going to have to stab one of our own men. He was asking if you were a Russian, Ahmedzadeh muttered from beside me, his Algerian accents rolling over the R in Russian. I flicked a glance at him, and he pointed at my hip. The gun, and your pale eyes. He thinks you are a Russian. Qadrbai walked between the men, and put his hand on the madman's shoulder. The man turned immediately, and with eyes that seemed ready to weep, searched Kader's face. Kader repeated what Nazir had been murmuring in a similarly soothing tone. I couldn't understand all of it, but the sense was clear. No, he is American. The Americans are here to help us. He is here with us to fight the Russians. He will help us to kill the Russians. He will help us. We will kill many Russians together. When the man turned to face me once more, his expression had changed so dramatically that I was moved to pity him when a moment before I was ready to run my knife into his chest. His eyes were still deranged, hanging unnaturally wide and white beneath the brown irises, but his frenzied expression had collapsed into such wretched, pitiable misery that his face reminded me of the many ruined stone cottages we'd seen beside the roads. He looked once more into Kader's face, and the stutter of a smile flickered across his features as if animated by an electric pulse. He turned and walked away through the crowd. The tough men parted for him warily, compassion vying with fear in their eyes as they watched him pass. I am sorry, Lin, Abdul Kader said softly. His name is Habib Abdur Rahman. He is a schoolteacher. Well, he once was a schoolteacher in a village on the other side of these mountains. He taught the little ones, the youngest children. When the Russians invaded, 7 years ago, he was a happy man, with a young wife and 2 strong sons. He joined the resistance, like every other young man in the region. 2 years ago he returned from a mission to find that the Russians had attacked his village. They had used gas, some kind of nerve gas. They deny it, Ahmedzadeh interjected. But while they fight this war, they're testing their new weapons. A lot of the weapons used here, landmines and rockets and everything, are new experimental weapons that have never been used in a war before. Like the gas that they used on Habib's village. There is no war like this one. Habib wandered alone through the village, Kader continued. Everyone was dead, all the men and the women and the children. All the generations of his family, his grandparents, from both sides, his parents, his wife's parents, his uncles and aunties, his brothers and sisters, his wife, and his children. All gone, in just 1 hour of one day. Even the animals, the goats and the sheep and the chickens, were all dead. Even the insects and the birds were dead. Nothing moved, nothing lived and nothing survived. He make, a bury, all men, all women, all children's. Nazir added. He buried them all, Kader nodded. All his family and his friends from childhood and his neighbors. It took so long to do it, all alone, that it was a very bad business at the end. Then, when the job was done, he took up his gun and rejoined his Mujahedin unit. But the loss had changed him in a terrible way. This time he was like a different man. This time he did everything in his power to capture a Russian or an Afghan soldier fighting for the Russians. And when he captured one, and he did capture them, many of them, because he was very good at it after that, when he did capture them, he tortured them to death by impaling them on a sharpened steel spike, made from the wooden handle and the blade of the shovel he had used to bury his family. He has it now. You can see it strapped to the top of his pack. He ties the prisoners to the spike by their hands, behind their backs, with the spike touching their backs. At the moment that their strength fails them, and the metal spike begins to tear its way through their bodies, forcing its way out through their stomachs, Habib leans over them, staring into their eyes, and spits into their screaming mouths. Khalid Ansari, Nazir, Ahmedzadeh, and I stood in a deeply breathing silence, waiting for Kader to speak again. There is no man who knows these mountains, and the region between here and Kandahar, better than Habib, Kader concluded, sighing wearily. He is the best guide. He has survived hundreds of missions in this region, and he will get us to our men in Kandahar. And there is no man more loyal or trustworthy, because there is no man in Afghanistan who hates the Russians more than Habib Abdur Rahman. But, he is completely insane, Ahmedzadeh offered into the silence with a Gallic shrug, and I found myself liking him, suddenly, and missing my friend Didier in the same instant. It was just the kind of pragmatic and brutally honest summary that Didier might have made. Yes, Kader agreed. He is insane. His grief has destroyed his mind. And for as much as we need him, there is the fact that he must be watched at all times. Every Mujahedin unit from here to Herat has cast him out. We are fighting the Afghan army that serves the Russians, but the fact is that they are Afghans. We receive most of our information from soldiers in the Afghan army who want to help us to win against their Russian masters. Habib cannot make this fine distinction. He has only one understanding of this war: to kill them all quickly, or to kill them slowly. And he prefers to kill them slowly. There is such a cruel violence in him that it frightens his friends no less than his enemies. So he must be watched while he is with us. I'll watch over him, Khalid Ansari declared firmly, and we all turned to look at our Palestinian friend. His face was set in an expression of suffering and anger and determination. The skin was tight across his eyes from brow to brow, and his mouth was drawn into a wide, flat line of tenacious resolve. "Very well," Kader began, and he would have said more, but with those 2 words of consent Khalid left us and walked toward the slumped, forlorn figure of Habib Abdur Rahman. Watching him leave, I was struck with a sudden, clutching instinct to cry out and stop him. It was a foolish thing, an irrational stabbing dread that I was losing him, losing another friend. And it was so ridiculous, so petty in its jealousy, that I bit down on it and said nothing. Then I watched him sit down opposite Habib. I watched him reach out to lift the gaping, murderous face of the madman until their eyes met and held, and I knew, without understanding it, that Khalid was lost to us. I dragged my eyes from the sight of them, as boatmen drag a lake with starry hooks. My mouth was dry, my heart was a prisoner pounding on the walls inside my head. My legs felt leaden, fixed to the earth with roots of shame and dread. And as I looked up at the sheer, impassable mountains, I felt the future shudder through me like thunder trembling through the limbs and wearied vines of a storming willow. Chapter 33. The main road from Chaman, in those years, crossed a tributary of the Dari River on the way to Spin Baldak, Dabri, and Melkaras on the highway route to Kandahar. The whole journey was less than 200 kilometers. By car, it took a few hours. We didn't take the highway route, of course, and we didn't have cars. We rode on horseback over 100 mountain passes, and the same journey took us more than a month. We spent that first day camped beneath the trees. The baggage, the goods we were smuggling into Afghanistan, and our personal supplies, was scattered in a nearby pasture, covered by sheepskins and goatskins to give the appearance, if seen from the air, of a herd of livestock. There were even a few real goats tethered among the woolly bundles. When dusk finally smothered the sunset, a whisper of excitement went through the camp. We soon heard the muffled tread of hooves as our horses approached. There were 20 riding horses and 15 pack animals. The horses were a little smaller than those I'd learned to ride on, and my heart lifted with hope that I might find them easier to control. Most of the men moved off at once to hoist and secure the baggage onto the pack animals. I started off to join them, but Nazir and Ahmedzadeh intercepted me, leading 2 horses. "This one is mine," Ahmed announced. "And that one is yours." Nazir handed the reins to me, and checked the straps on the short, thin Afghan saddle. Satisfying himself that all was as it should be, he nodded his approval. "Horse good," he said, in his grunting, gravel-throated version of good humor. "All horse good," I replied, quoting him. "All man not good." "The horse is superb," Ahmed concurred, casting an admiring eye over my horse. She was a chestnut mare, with a deep chest and strong, thick, relatively short legs. Her eyes were alert and unafraid. "Nazir picked her for you from all that we have. He was the first to reach her, and there are some disappointed men back there. He is a good judge. We've got 30 men, by my count, but there's less than 30 riding horses here, for sure," I remarked, patting at the neck of my horse, and trying to establish first contact with the beast. "Yes, some ride and some walk," Ahmed replied. He put his left foot in his stirrup and swung into the saddle with an effortless spring. "We take turns. There are goats, 10 goats with us, and men will herd them. And we will lose some men on our way, also. The horses are really a gift for Kader's people near Kandahar. We would be better on this trip with camels. Donkeys would be the best, in my opinion, in the narrow passes. But the horses are animals of great status. I think Kader insisted on using horses because it is important how we look when we make contact with the wild clans, the men who will want to kill us and take our guns and our medicines. The horses will make us important in their eyes. And they will be a gift of much prestige for Kader Khan's people. He plans to give them away on the way back from Kandahar. We will ride some of the way to Kandahar, but we will walk all the way home." "Did you say we're going to lose some men?" I asked, frowning up at him. "Yes," he laughed. Some men will leave us on the way, to return to their villages. But yes, also, it might be that some will die on this journey. But we will live, you and I, inshallah. We have good horses. It is a good beginning. He wheeled the horse expertly and cantered over to a mounted group who'd assembled around Qadrbai some 50 meters away. I glanced at Nazir. He nodded for me to mount the horse, offering me an encouraging little grimace and a muttered prayer. We both fully expected that I would be thrown, and his eyes began to close in cringing anticipation. I put my foot in the stirrup and sprang off with my right foot. I hit the saddle with a harder jolt than I'd planned, but the horse responded well to the mount and dipped her head twice, anxious to move off. Nazir opened one eye to see me sitting comfortably on the new horse. Delighted and flushed with unself-conscious pride, he beamed one of his rare smiles at me. I tugged at the reins to turn the horse's head and kicked backward. The horse responded calmly, but with a smart, stylish, almost prancing elegance in its movement. Snapping at once into a graceful canter, she took me toward Qadrbai's group with no further prompting. Nazir ran along with us, a little behind and to the left of my horse. I glanced over my shoulder and exchanged equally wide-eyed, bewildered looks with him. The horse was making me look good. "It's gonna be okay," I whispered to myself, knowing, as the words trotted through the thick fog of vain hope in my mind, that I'd uttered the certain Jinx formula. The saying, "Pride goeth before a fall," is condensed from the second collection of the Book of Proverbs, 16:18. Pride goeth before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. It's attributed to Solomon. If he did say it, Solomon was a man who knew horses intimately well, much better than I did as I clicked up to Cater's group and reined the horse in as though I would ever know, what I was doing in a saddle. Cater was speaking in Pashto and Urdu and Farsi, giving the men last-minute instructions. I leaned across to whisper to Ahmedzadeh, "Where's the pass? I can't see it in the dark." "What pass?" he whispered back. "The pass through the mountains." "You mean Chaman?" he asked, mystified by the question. "It's back there, 30 kilometers behind us." "No, I mean how do we get through those mountains into Afghanistan?" I asked, nodding toward the sheer rock walls that began to rise less than a kilometer away from us, and peaked in the black night sky above. "We don't go through the mountains," Ahmed replied, gesturing a little jab with the reins in his hands. "We go over them." "Over them? We. Tonight. We. In the dark. We," he repeated seriously. "But no problem. Habib, the foo, the crazy one, he knows the way. He will lead us." "I'm glad you told me that. I was worried, I admit, but I feel a lot better about it now." His white teeth flashed a laugh at me and then, with a signal from Khalid, we moved off, churning slowly into a single column that stretched to almost 100 meters. There were 10 men walking, 20 men riding, 15 packhorses, and a herd of 10 goats. I noticed with deep chagrin that Nazir was one of the men walking. It was absurd and unnatural, somehow, that such a fine horseman was walking while I rode. I watched him, ahead of me in the darkness, watched the rhythmic roll of his thick, slightly bowed legs, and I swore to myself that I would convince him, at the first rest break, to take turns with me in riding my horse. I did eventually succeed in that resolve, but Nazir was so reluctantly persuaded that he glowered miserably at me from the saddle, and only ever brightened when our positions reversed and he looked up at me from the rocky path. "You don't ride a horse over a mountain, of course. You push and drag and sometimes help to carry a horse over a mountain." As we neared the base of the sheer cliffs that form the Chaman Range, dividing the southwestern part of Afghanistan from Pakistan, it became clear that there were in fact gaps and pathways and trails leading into and over them. What had seemed to be smooth walls of bare, mountainous rock proved on closer inspection to be formed in undulating waves of ravines and tiered crevices. Ledges of stone and lime-encrusted barren earth wound through those rocky slopes. In places the ledges were so wide and well flattened as to seem like a man-made road. In places they were so jagged and narrow that every footstep of horse or man was brooded over with careful, trembling consideration before it was made. And the whole of it, the whole stumbling, slipping, dragging, shoving breach of the mountain barrier, was done in the dark. Ours was a small caravan when compared to the once mighty tribal processions that had plied the Silk Route between Turkey and China and India, but in that time of war our numbers were remarkable. The fear of being seen from the air was a constant worry. Kotarbai imposed a strict blackout, no cigarettes, torches, or lamps on the march. There was a quarter moon that first night, but occasionally the slippery paths led us through narrow defiles where smooth rock rose up sharply, drowning us in shadows. In those black-walled corridors it was impossible to see my own hand held in front of my face. The whole column inched its way along the blind clefts in the rock wall, men and horses and goats pressed hard against the stone, and shuffling into one another. In the center of just such a black ravine, I heard a low whining sound that rose quickly in pitch. I was walking, or sliding my feet, between two horses. I had the reins of my horse in my right hand, and the tail of the horse in front wrapped around my left hand. My face was sliding against the granite wall, and the path beneath my feet was no wider than the length of my arm. As the sound rose in its pitch and intensity, the two horses reared in the same instinct, and stamped their hooves in staccato fear. Then the whining sound suddenly erupted in a roar that rattled the whole mountain, and ripped into an explosive, shrieking scream of satanic noise directly over our heads. The horse to my left bucked and reared in front of me, pulling its tail from my hand. Trying to retrieve it, I lost my footing in the dark and slid to my knees, my face scraping against the rock wall. My own horse was terrified, as frightened as I was myself, and it struggled forward on the narrow path, following an impulse to run. I still held the reins, and I used them to pull myself to my feet, but the horse rammed into me again with its head, and I felt myself slide backward from the path. Fear stabbed into my chest and crushed my heart as I stumbled, slid, and fell off the path into the lightless void. I fell the full length of my body, and stopped with a wrenching snap as the reins in my hand held fast. I was dangling in free space over a black abyss. Millimeter by millimeter I felt the downward creep, the easing, slipping creak of leather as I slid further from the edge of the narrow ledge. I could hear the shouts of men, all along the ledge above me. They were trying to calm the animals, and they were calling out names to account for their friends. I could hear the horses screaming their fear and snorting in protest. The air in the ravine was thick with the smells of piss and horseshit and frightened man sweat. And I could hear the scrabbling, scraping clatter of hooves as my own horse struggled to maintain its footing. I suddenly realized that as strong as the horse undoubtedly was, its foothold on the crumbling, jagged path was so precarious that my weight might have been enough to drag it over the ledge with me. Flailing with my left hand in the impenetrable dark, I grasped the reins and began to drag myself back up to the ledge. I put one set of fingertips on the edge of the stony path and then choked a scream as I slipped backwards into the dark crevasse. The reins held again, and I dangled over the gap, but my situation was desperate. The horse, fearing that it would be dragged over the edge, was shaking and dipping its head violently. An intelligent animal, she was trying to rid herself of the bridle, bit, and harness. At any moment, I knew, she would succeed. I gave a snarl of rage through clenched teeth and dragged myself to the ledge once more. Scrambling up to my knees, I gasped in sweating exhaustion and then, working to an intuition that starts in fear and spikes on a jet of adrenaline, I jumped up and to my right as my neighbor's horse kicked out in the black, blind night. If I hadn't moved, it would have struck me on the side of the head, and my war would have ended there and then. Instead, the life-saving reflex to jump meant that the blow struck my hip and thigh, driving me into the wall and against my own horse's head. I threw my arms around the animal's neck, as much to comfort myself with its touch as to support my numb leg and aching hip. I was still cradling her head in my arms when I heard shuffling steps and felt someone's hands slide from the wall onto my back. "Lynn, is that you?" Khalid Ansari asked into the darkness. "Khalid, yeah, are you okay?" "Sure. Jet fighters. Fuck me. 2 of them, not far overhead. 100 feet, man, no more than that. Fuck, they were really smashing up the sound barrier. What a noise. Were they Russians? No, I don't think so. Not this close to the border. More likely they were Pakistani fighters, American planes with Pak pilots, crossing a little into Afghan space to keep the Russians on their toes. They won't go too far. The Russian MiG pilots are too good. But the Paks like to remind them they're here, just the same. Are you sure you're all right?" Sure, I lied. I'll be a lot better when we get out of this fucking dark." Call me a weak motherfucker, but I like to see where I'm going when I'm trying to lead a horse along a ledge outside a 10-story building. Me, too, Khaled laughed. It was the small, sad laugh, but I drenched myself in the reassurance of it. Who was behind you? Ahmed, I replied. Ahmed Zadeh. I heard him swearing in French back there. I think he's okay. Nazir was behind him, and I know Mahmoud, the Iranian, was near him somewhere. There were about 10 behind me, I think, counting the 2 guys herding the goats. I'll go check, Khaled said, giving me a comforting slap on the shoulder. You keep going. Just slide along the wall for another 100 yards or so. It's not far. There's still some moonlight when you get out there, outside this ravine. Good luck. And for a few moments, when I reached that pale oasis of moonlight, I felt safe and sure of myself. Then we pushed on, hugging the cold, gray stone of the canyon silo, and in minutes we were in blackness again, with nothing but faith and fear and the will to survive. We traveled so often at night that we sometimes seemed to be feeling our way to Kandahar like blind men, with our fingertips. And, like blind men, we trusted Habib, without question, as our guide. None of the Afghans in our group lived in the border region, and they were as dependent on his knowledge of those secret passes and fortuitous ledge pathways as I was. When he wasn't leading the column, however, Habib inspired far less confidence. I came upon him once as I scrambled over some rocks to find a place to take a piss during a rest stop. He was kneeling in front of a roughly square slab of stone and beating his forehead against it. I leapt down to stop him and discovered that he was weeping, sobbing. The blood from his torn forehead ran down his face to mix with the tears in his beard. I poured a little water from my canteen onto a corner of my scarf, and wiped the blood from his head to examine the wounds. They were rough and jagged, but largely superficial. He allowed me to lead him, unprotesting, back to the camp. Khaled rushed up at once and helped me to apply ointment and a clean bandage to his forehead. I left him alone, Khaled muttered when the job was done. I thought he was praying. He told me he wanted to pray. But I had a feeling. I think he was praying, I answered. I'm worried, Khaled confessed, looking into my eyes with a febrile mix of heartbreak and fear. He keeps setting man-traps all over the place. He's got 20 grenades on him under that cloak. I've tried to explain to him that a man-trap has no conscience. It might just as easily kill a local nomad shepherd, or one of us, as a Russian or an Afghan soldier. He doesn't get it. He just grins at me and does it a little bit more secret. He rigged some of the horses with explosives yesterday. He said it was to make sure the Russians didn't get their hands on them. I said to him, what about us? What if the Russians get their hands on us? Should we be rigged with explosives, too? He said it was a problem he worried about all the time, how to make sure we were dead before the Russians got their hands on us, and how to kill more Russians after we were dead. Does Kader know? No, I'm trying to keep Habib in line. I know where he's coming from, Lynn. I've been there. The first couple years after my family was killed, I was as crazy as he is. I know what's going on inside him. He's filled up with so many dead friends and enemies that he's kind of locked on one course, killing Russians, and until he snaps out of it, I just gotta stay with him as much as I can, and watch his ass. I think you should tell Kader, I sighed, shaking my head. I will, he sighed in return. I will. Soon. I'll talk to him soon. He'll get better. Habib will get better. He's getting better in some ways. I can talk to him real well now. He'll make it. But as the weeks of the journey passed, we all watched Habib more closely, more fearfully, and little by little we all realized why so many other Mujahideen units had cast him out. With our senses alert for menace from without and within, we traveled by night, and sometimes by day, north along the mountainous border towards Pathan Kel. Near the Kel, or village, we swung north-northwest into deserted mountainous terrain that was veined with cold, fresh, sweet water streams. Habib laid out a route that was roughly equidistant between towns and larger villages, always avoiding the main arteries that local people used. We trudged between Pathan Kel and Cairo Thana, between Humay Karas and Haji Aga Muhammad. We forded rivers between Loe Karas and Yaru. We zigzagged between Mullah Mustafa and the little village of Abdul Hamid. Local pirates, demanding tribute, stopped us 3 times on the way. Each time, They revealed themselves at first in high vantage points, with guns trained on us, before their ground forces swept from hiding to lock the way forward and cut off our retreat. Each time, Kader raised his green and white mujahideen flag emblazoned with the Quranic phrase, Inna lillahi wa inna ilaihi raji'un. We come from God, and unto God do we return. Although the local clans didn't recognize Kader's standard, they respected its language and intent. Their fierce, belligerent postures remained, however, until Kader, Nazir, and our Afghan fighters explained to them that the group was traveling with, and under the protection of, an American. When the local pirates had examined my passport and stared hard into my blue-gray eyes, they welcomed us as comrades in arms, and invited us to drink tea and feast with them. The invitation was a euphemism for the honor of paying them a tribute. Although none of the pirates we encountered wanted to upset the critically important American aid that helped to sustain them in the long years of the war by attacking an American-sponsored caravan, it was unthinkable that we might pass through their territory without providing some plunder. Kader had brought a supply of bakshish goods for that very purpose. There were silks in peacock blue and green, with rich interweavings of gold thread. There were hatchets and thick-bladed knives and sewing kits. There were Zeiss binoculars. Kader had given me a pair, and I used them every day, and magnifying spectacles for reading the Quran, and solid, Indian-made automatic watches. And for the clan leaders there was a small hoard of gold tablets, each weighing 1 tola, or about 10 grams, and embossed with the Afghan laurel. Kader hadn't merely anticipated those pirate attacks, he'd counted on them. Once the formal courtesies and tribute negotiations were concluded, Kader arranged with each local clan leader to resupply our caravan. The resupply provided us with rations while we were on the move, and also guaranteed us food and animal feed at fraternal villages that were under the control or protection of the clan leader. The resupply was essential. The munitions, machine parts, and medicines that we carried were priorities, and left us little room for surplus cargo. Thus we carried a little food for the horses, 2 days' ration at most, but we carried no food at all for ourselves. Each man had a canteen of water, but it was understood that it was an emergency ration, to be used sparingly for ourselves and the horses. Many were the days we passed with no more than 1 glass of water to drink, and 1 small piece of naan bread to eat. I was a vegetarian, without being a fanatic about it, when I started on that journey. For years I'd usually preferred to eat my fruit and vegetable diet when it was available. 3 weeks into the trek, after dragging horses across mountains and freezing rivers, and trembling from hunger, I fell on the lamb and goat meat that the pirates offered us, and ripped the flesh half-cooked from the bones with my teeth. The steep mountain slopes of the country were barren, burned of life by biting wintry winds, but every flat plain, no matter how small, was a vivid, living green. There were wild flowers with red, starry faces, and others with sky-blue pom-pom heads. There were short, scrubby bushes with tiny yellow leaves that the goats enjoyed, and many varieties of wild grasses topped with feathery bowers of dried seed for the horses. There were lime-green mosses on many of the rocks, and paler lichens on others. The impact of those tender, viridescent carpets between the endlessly undulating crocodiles back of naked stone mountains was far greater than it might have been in a more fertile and equable landscape. We responded to each new sight of a softly carpeted incline or tufted, leafy moor with similar pleasure, a deep, subliminal response to the vitality in the color green. More than a few of the tough, hardened fighters, trudging between the walking horses, stooped to gather a little clutch of flowers so that they might simply feel the beauty of them in their dry and calloused hands. My status as Kader's American helped us to negotiate the badlands of the local pirates, but it also cost us a week when we were stopped for the 3rd and last time. In an effort to avoid the little village of Abdul Hamid, our guide Habib led us into a small canyon that was just wide enough for 3 or 4 horses to ride side by side. Steep rock walls rose up on either side of the canyon trail for almost a kilometer before the funnel opened out into a much longer, wider valley. It was the perfect place for an ambush and, in anticipation, Kader rode at the head of our column with his green and white banner unfurled. The challenge came before we were 100 meters into the gorge. There was a chilling ululation from high above, men's voices raised in an imitation of the high-pitched, warbling wail of tribal women, and a sudden tumble of small boulders as a little avalanche spilled into the canyon before us. Like others, I turned in my saddle to see that a platoon of local tribesmen had taken up positions behind us with a variety of weapons trained on our backs. We halted immediately at the first sound. Cater slowly rode on alone for some 200 meters. He stopped there, with his back straight in the saddle and his standard fluttering in the strong, chill breeze. The seconds of a long minute ticked away with the guns behind us and the rocks poised above. Then a lone figure appeared, riding toward Cater on a tall camel. Although the two-humped Bactrian camel is native to Afghanistan, the rider's was a single-humped Arabian camel, the type bred by long-distance cameleers of the northern Tajik region for use in extremes of cold. It had a mop of hair on its head, thick and shaggy neck fur, and long, powerful legs. The man riding that impressive beast was tall and lean, and appeared to be at least 10 years older than Cater's fit 60+. He wore a long, white shirt over white Afghan pants, and a knee-length, sleeveless, black serge vest. A snowy white turban of sumptuous length was piled majestically on his head. His gray-white beard was trimmed away from the upper lip and the mouth, descending from his chin to nudge his thin chest. Some of my friends in Bombay had called that kind of beard a Wahhabi, after the sternly orthodox Saudi Arabian Muslims who trimmed their beards in that way to imitate the style preferred by the Prophet. It was a sign to us, in the canyon, that the stranger possessed at least as much moral authority as temporal power. The latter was emphasized with spectacular effect by the antique, long-barreled Jazale that he held upright, balanced on his hip. The muzzle-loaded rifle was decorated along all of its wooden surfaces with gleaming discs, scrolls, and diamond shapes fashioned from brass and silver coins and polished to a dazzling brilliance. The man drew up beside Qadrbai, facing us and within a hand's reach of our Khan. His bearing was commanding, and it was clear that he was accustomed to a comprehensive respect. He was, in fact, one of the very few men I ever came to know who equaled Abdul Qadir Khan in the esteem, perhaps even the veneration, that he commanded from others with nothing more or less than his bearing and the sheer force of his fully realized life. After a lengthy discussion, Qadrbai wheeled his horse gently to face us. "Mr. John," he called to me, using the first name in my false American passport and speaking in English. "Come here to me, please." I kicked backward, uttering what I hoped was an encouraging sound. All eyes on the ground and above us were on me, I knew, and in the swollen, silent seconds I had a vision of the horse throwing me to the ground at Cater's feet. But the mare responded with a smart, prancing canter, and found her own way through the column to stop at Cater's side. "This is Haji Muhammad," Cater announced. He swept around us with a broad movement of his open palm. "He is the Khan, the leader of all the people, in all the clans, and all the families here." "Assalamu alaikum," I said in greeting, holding my hand over my heart as a gesture of respect. Believing me to be an infidel, the leader didn't respond to my greeting. The Prophet Muhammad adjured his followers to return the peaceful greeting of a believer with an even more polite greeting. Thus the greeting "Assalamu alaikum," peace be with you, should have been answered, at the very least, with "Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah," and "with you be peace and the compassion of Allah." Instead, the old man stared down from his perch on the camel and greeted me with a hard question. "When will you give us stingers to fight with?" It was the same question every Afghan had asked me, the American, since we'd entered the country. And although Qadrbai translated it for me again, I understood the words and I'd rehearsed the answer. "It will be soon, if Allah wills it, and the sky will be as free as the mountains." It was a good answer and Haji Muhammad was pleased with it, but it was a much better question, and it deserved a better response than my hopeful lie. The Afghans, from Mazar-i-Sharif to Kandahar, knew that if the Americans had given them Stinger missiles at the outbreak of the war, the Mujahideen would have beaten the invaders back within months. Stingers meant that the hated and mortally effective Russian helicopters could be smashed from the skies. Even the formidable MiG fighters were vulnerable to a hand-launched Stinger missile. Without the insuperable advantage of the air, the Russians and their Afghan army proxies would be forced to fight a ground war against the Mujahideen resistance, a ground war they could never win. Cynics among the Afghans believed that the Americans refused to supply Stingers for the first 7 years of the conflict, because they wanted Russia to win just enough of the Afghan war to overreach and overcommit themselves. If and when the Stingers finally arrived, the Russians would suffer a defeat that cost them so much in men and resources that their entire Soviet empire would collapse. And whether the cynics were right or wrong, the deadly game did play itself out in exactly that way. The Stinger missiles did turn the tide of the conflict, when they were finally introduced, a few months after Kader led us into Afghanistan. The Russians were so weakened by the war of resistance fought by those very Afghan villagers, and millions like them, that their monstrous, Caligulan empire crumbled around them. It worked, it played out that way, and what it cost was 1 million Afghan lives. What it cost was 1/3 of the population forced from their homeland. What it cost was one of the largest forced migrations in human history, 3.5 million refugees moving through the Khyber Pass to Peshawar, and 1 million more exiled in Iran, India, and the Muslim republics of the Soviet Union. What it cost was 50,000 men, women, and children with one or more limbs amputated through landmine explosions. What it cost was the Afghan heart and soul. And I, a wanted criminal, working for a mafia crime lord, impersonated an American and looked those people in the eye, and lied to them about the weapons I couldn't give them. Haji Muhammad liked my answer so much that he invited our group to attend the wedding celebrations of his youngest son. Concerned that a refusal might offend the elderly leader, and genuinely touched by the generous invitation, Kader accepted. When all the tributes were exacted, Haji Muhammad drove a hard bargain, demanding and receiving Kader's own horse as an additional, personal gift, Kaderbai, Nazir, and I agreed to accompany the leader to his kell. The rest of our column made camp in a pastured valley with plentiful fresh water. The break in our forced march allowed the men to groom and rest the horses. The pack animals were in constant need of attention and, with the cargo concealed in a protected cave, the unburdened beasts were free to gambol and roam. Our men prepared to feast on 4 roasting sheep, aromatic Indian rice, and fresh green leaf tea provided by Haji's village as their contribution to our part in the jihad. With the practical business of tributes negotiated and received, the senior men of Haji Muhammad's village, like all the Afghan clan leaders we'd encountered on the journey, acknowledged us as fighters in the same cause, and offered every help they could provide. As Kader, Nazir, and I rode away from the temporary camp toward the kell, the sounds of singing and laughter followed us, echo chasing playful echo. It was the first time we'd heard that lightness of heart from our men in the 23 days of the journey. Haji Muhammad's village was in celebration when we arrived. His profitable, bloodless encounter with our column of armed men had added to the gathering thrill of anticipation for the wedding. Kader explained how the elaborate rituals of Afghan matrimony had been unfolding for months before we'd arrived. There'd been ceremonial visits between the family of the groom and the family of the bride. In every case, small gifts such as handkerchiefs or scented sweets had been exchanged, and precise courtesies were observed. The bride's dowry of extravagantly embroidered cloths, imported silks, perfumes, and jewelry had been publicly displayed for all to admire, and was then held in trust for her by the groom's family. The groom had even visited his bride to be in secret, and he'd presented her with personal gifts as he spoke to her. According to custom, it was strictly forbidden for him to be seen by the men in her family during that secret visit, but custom also required him to be helped by the girl's mother. The dutiful mother, Kader assured me, had remained with the couple while they spoke to one another for the first time, and had acted as their chaperone. With all that achieved, the couple was ready for the culmination of the marriage ceremony itself, to be held in 3 days' time. Kader took me through the finest details of the rituals, and it seemed to me that there was a kind of urgency in his normally gentle teacher's manner. At first I guessed, rightly, I think, that he was reacquainting himself with the customs of his people after his 5 long decades in exile. He was reliving the scenes and celebrations of his youth, and he was proving to himself that he was still Afghan, in all that his heart knew and felt. But as the lessons continued through the following days, and the intensity of his attention to them never failed, I finally realized that the long explanations and histories were for my benefit more than his. He was giving me a crash course in the culture of the nation where I might be killed and where my body might be laid to rest. He was making sense of it, my life with him, and my possible death, in the only way that he knew. And understanding that, without ever speaking of it to him, I listened dutifully and learned everything I could. Kinsmen, friends, and other invitees streamed into Haji's village during those days. The four main houses of Haji Muhammad's fortress-like men's kala, or compound, were tall, square, mud brick buildings. High walls surrounded the kala, and one large dwelling stood in each of the four corners. The women's kala was a separate set of buildings behind even higher walls. In the men's compound we slept on the floor and cooked all our own meals. It was already crowded in the house that Kader, Nazir, and I joined, but, as new men arrived from distant villages, we all simply squashed in further. Sleeping in our clothes, we top and tailed across the whole floor, each man sleeping with his head beside the feet of the next. There's a theory that snoring at night in sleep is a subconscious defense reflex, a warning sound that frightened potential predators away from the mouth of the cave when our lower Paleolithic ancestors huddled in vulnerable sleep. That group of Afghan nomads, cameleers, sheep and goat herders, farmers, and guerrilla fighters lent credibility to the idea, for they snored so thunderously and with such persistent ferocity through the long, cold night that they would have frightened a pride of ravenous lions into scattering like startled mice. During the day, the same men prepared complex food dishes for the Friday wedding. Those dishes included flavored yogurts, pecan goats or sheep's milk cheeses, oven-baked cakes made with corn flour, dates, nuts, and wild honey, biscuits baked with richly churned goat's milk butter and, of course, a variety of halal meats and vegetable pulao. While the foods were being prepared, I watched as men dragged a foot-operated grinding wheel into an open space, and the groom devoted a tense hour to putting a razor's edge to a large, ornate dagger. The bride's father watched that effort with a critical eye. After satisfying himself that the weapon was suitably lethal, he gravely accepted it as a gift from the younger man. The groom has just sharpened the knife that the bride's father will use on him if he ever mistreats the girl, Kader explained to me as we watched. That's a pretty good custom, I mused. It is not a custom, Kader corrected me, with a laugh. It is his idea, the bride's father. I have never heard of it before this. But if it works, it might become a custom. Each day the men also rehearsed ritual group dances with the musicians and singers who'd been hired to complement the formal, public celebration. The dancing gave me the chance to see a new and completely unexpected side of Nazir. He hurled himself into the whirling chorus line of men with grace and passion. Moreover, my short, bow-legged friend, whose bulky arms seemed to jut outward from the tree trunk of his thick neck and chest, was by far the best dancer in the entire assembly, and quickly earned their admiration. The whole secret and invisible inner life of the man, his full creative and spiritual endowment, was expressed in the dance. And that face, I'd said, once, that I'd never seen another human face in which the smile was so utterly defeated. That scowl-creased face was transfigured in the dance until his honest, selfless beauty was so radiant that it filled my eyes with tears. "Tell me once more," Abdul Qadir Khan commanded, with a roguish smile in his eye, as we watched the dancers from a vantage point beneath a shaded wall. I laughed. When I turned to look at him, he laughed as well. "Go on," he urged. "Do it to please me. But you've heard this 20 times from me already. How about you answer me a question instead? You tell me once more, and then I will answer your question." Okay, here goes. The universe began about 15 billion years ago, in almost absolute simplicity, and it's been getting more and more complex ever since. This movement from the simple to the complex is built into the web and weave of the universe, and it's called the tendency toward complexity. We're the products of this complexification, and so are the birds, and the bees, and the trees, and the stars, and even the galaxies of stars. And if we were to get wiped out in a cosmic explosion, like an asteroid impact or something, some other expression of our level of complexity would emerge, because that's what the universe does. And this is likely to be going on all over the universe. How am I doing so far? I waited, but he didn't reply, so I continued with my summary. Okay, the final or ultimate complexity, the place where all this complexity is going, is what, or who, we might call God. And anything that promotes, enhances, or accelerates this movement toward God is good. Anything that inhibits, impedes, or prevents it is evil. And if we want to know if something is good or evil, something like war and killing and smuggling guns to mujahideen guerrillas, for example, then we ask the questions. What if everyone did this thing? Would that help us, in this bit of the universe, to get there, or would it hold us back? And then we have a pretty good idea whether it's good or evil. What's more important, we know why it's good or evil. There, how was that? Very good, he said without looking at me. While I'd run through the summary of his cosmological model, he'd closed his eyes and nodded his head, pursing his lips in a half-smile. When I concluded it, he turned to look at me, and the smile widened as the pleasure and the mischief sparked in his eyes. You know, if you wanted to do it, you could express this idea every bit as well and as accurately as I do. And I've been working on it and thinking about it for almost all of my life. I cannot tell you how happy it makes me feel to hear you tell it to me in your own words. I think the words are yours, Cotter G. You've coached me often enough. But I do have a couple of problems. Do I get my question now? Yes. Okay. We've got things like rocks in the world that aren't alive, and living things like trees and fish and people. Your cosmology doesn't tell me where life and consciousness come from. If rocks are made out of the same stuff that people are made out of, how come rocks aren't alive, but people are? I mean, where does life come from? I know you well enough to be sure that you want me to give you a short, direct answer to this question. I think I'd like a short, direct answer to every question, I replied, laughing. He raised an eyebrow at the foolishness of my flippant response and then shook his head slowly. Do you know the English philosopher Bertrand Russell? Have you read any of his books? Yeah, I read some of his stuff, at university and in prison. He was a favorite of my dear Mr. Mackenzie Esquire, Cater smiled. I do not often agree with Bertrand Russell's conclusions, but I do like the way he arrives at them. Anyway, he once said, anything that can be put in a nutshell should remain there. And I do agree with him about that. But now, the answer to your question is this. Life is a feature of all things. We could call it a characteristic, which is one of my favorite English words. If you do not speak English as your first language, the word, characteristic, has an amazing sound, like rapping on a drum, or breaking kindling wood for a fire. To continue, every atom in the universe has the characteristic of life. The more complex way that atoms get put together, the more complex is the expression of the characteristic of life. A rock is a very simple arrangement of atoms, so the life in a rock is so simple that we cannot see it. A cat is a very complex arrangement of atoms, so the life in a cat is very obvious. But life is there, in everything, even in a rock, and even when we cannot see it. Where did you get this idea? Is it in the Koran? Actually, it is a concept that appears in one way or another in most of the great religions. I have changed it slightly to suit what we have learned about the world in the last few hundred years. But the Holy Koran gives me my inspiration for this kind of study, because the Koran commands me to study everything and learn everything in order to serve Allah. But where does this life characteristic come from? I insisted, sure that I had him trapped in a reductionist dead end at last. Life, and all the other characteristics of all the things in the universe, such as consciousness and free will, and the tendency toward complexity, and even love, was given to the universe by light, at the beginning of time as we know it. At the Big Bang? Is that what you're talking about? Yes. The Big Bang expansion happened from a point called a singularity, another of my favorite 5-syllable English words. That is almost infinitely dense, and almost infinitely hot, and yet it occupies no space and no time, as we know those things. The point is a boiling cauldron of light energy. Something caused it to expand. We don't know yet what caused it, and from light, all the particles and all the atoms came to exist, along with space and time and all the forces that we know. So, light gave every little particle at the beginning of the universe a set of characteristics, and as those particles combine in more complex ways, the characteristics show themselves in more and more complex ways. He paused, watching my face as I struggled with the concepts and questions and emotions that looped in my mind. He got away from me again, I thought, suddenly furious with him for having an answer to my question, and yet struck with admiring respect for the same reason. There was always something eerily incongruous in the wise lectures, sometimes they were like sermons, of the Mafia Don Abdul Qadir Khan. Sitting there against a stone wall in an all-but Stone Age village in Afghanistan, with a cargo of smuggled guns and antibiotics nearby, the dissonance created by his calm, profound discourse about good and evil, and light and life and consciousness, was enough to fill me with exasperated irritation. What I have just told you is the relationship between consciousness and matter, Cater proclaimed, pausing again until he had my eye. This is a kind of test, and now you know it. This is a test that you should apply to every man who tells you that he knows the meaning of life. Every guru you meet and every teacher, every prophet and every philosopher, should answer these two questions for you. What is an objective, universally acceptable definition of good and evil? And, what is the relationship between consciousness and matter? If he cannot answer these two questions, as I have done, you know that he has not passed the test. How do you know all this physics? I demanded. All this about particles and singularities and big bangs? He stared at me, reading the full measure of the unconscious insult. How is it that an Afghan gangster like you knows so much about science and higher knowledge? I looked back at him, remembering a day at the slum with Johnny Cigar when I'd made the cruel mistake of assuming him to be ignorant simply because he was poor. There is a saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. Do you know it? He asked, laughing. It seemed that he was laughing at me rather than with me. Yes, I whistled patiently, through clenched teeth. Well, just at the point in my studies of philosophy and religion when I came to need the special knowledge of a scientist, one appeared for me. I knew that there were many answers for me in the science of life and stars and chemistry. But, unfortunately, these were not the things that my dear Mackenzie Esquire taught to me, except in the most elementary fashion. Then I met a physicist, a man who was working at the Bhabha Atomic Research Center in Bombay. He was a very good man, but he had a weakness for gambling at that time. He found himself in big trouble. He lost a lot of money that was not his to lose. He was gambling at one of the clubs owned by a man I knew well, a man who worked for me, if I needed it. And there was more trouble. The scientist was involved with a woman. He fell in love with her, and he did stupid things for the sake of this love, and so there were many dangers. When he came to me, I solved the problems of this scientist, and kept all the matters strictly between us. No one else ever knew the details of his indiscretions, or of my involvement in solving them. And, in exchange for this, the man has been teaching me ever since that day. His name is Wolfgang Persis, and I have arranged it that you will meet him, if you wish, soon after we return. How long has he been teaching you? We have been studying together once every week for the past 7 years. Jesus! I gasped, thinking, with a little curl of mean delight, that wise and mighty Kader hacked out his pound of flesh when it suited him. In another heartbeat I was ashamed of the thought. I loved Kader Khan enough to follow him into a war. Wasn't it possible that the scientist loved him just as well? And in thinking that, I knew I was jealous of the man, the scientist I didn't know and probably would never meet. Jealousy, like the flawed love that bears it, has no respect for time or space or wisely reasoned argument. Jealousy can raise the dead with a single, spiteful taunt, or hate a perfect stranger for nothing more than the sound of his name. You were asking about life, Kader said gently, changing tack, because you were thinking about death. And you were thinking about the taking of a life, if it happens that you must shoot a man. Am I right in this? Yeah, I muttered. He was right, but the killing that preoccupied me wasn't in Afghanistan. The life I wanted to take was perched on a throne, in a secret room in a grotesque brothel called the Palace, in Bombay. Madam Joe. Remember, Kader said insistently, resting his hand on my forearm to emphasize his words. Sometimes it is necessary to do the wrong thing for the right reasons. The important thing is to be sure that our reasons are right, and that we admit the wrong. That we do not lie to ourselves, and convince ourselves that what we do is right. And later, as the wedding whirled and clamored to the last wail of its rejoicing, and as we rejoined our men and scrambled, clattered, and strained our way across new mountains, I tried to unwind the wreath of thorns that Kader had coiled around my heart with his words. The wrong thing for the right reasons. Once before he'd tormented me with that phrase. I chewed at it, in my mind, as a bear will chew at a leather strap that binds it by the leg. In my life, the wrong things were almost always done for the wrong reasons. Even the right things that I did were too often goaded by the wrong reasons. A gloomy mood enwrapped me. It was a sullen, doubting temper that I couldn't shake off, and as we rode into the winter I thought often of Anand Rao, my neighbor from the slum. I remembered Anand's face smiling at me through the metal grill of the visitors' room at Arthur Road Prison. That gentle, handsome face, so serene, and softened with the peace that had suffused his heart. He'd done the wrong thing for the right reasons, as he saw it. He'd calmly accepted the punishment that he'd earned, as he said to me, as if it was a privilege or a right. And at last, after too many thinking days and nights, I cursed Anand. I cursed him to drive him from my mind because a voice kept telling me, my own voice, or maybe it was my father's, that I would never know that peace. I would never come to that Eden in the soul, where acceptance of punishment and acknowledgement of wrong and right roll away the troubles that lodge like stones in the barren field of an exiled heart. Moving north again at night, we climbed and crossed the narrow Kusa Pass in the Hada Mountains. The journey of 30 kilometers was closer to 150 climbing and descending kilometers for us. Then, exposed to the wide sky, we traveled over flatter land for almost 50 kilometers to cross the Argaston River and its tributaries 3 times before we reached the foothills of the Shabad Pass. And there, with my mind still choked on its rights and wrongs, we were fired on for the first time. Kader's command that we commence the climb of the Shabad Pass without a rest saved many lives, including my own, that cold evening. We were exhausted after the headlong, trotting march across the open plain. Every man among us hoped for rest at the foothills of the pass, but Kader urged us on, riding the length of the column and shouting for us to keep on, and keep up the pace. Thus we were moving fast when the first shots were fired. I heard the sound, a hollow metal tapping, as if someone was rapping on the side of an empty gasoline can with a piece of copper pipe. Stupidly, I didn't associate it with gunfire at first, and I kept trudging forward, leading my horse by the reins. Then the bullets found their range, and they smashed into the ground, our column, and the rock walls around us.